Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for joining us. Mary is the Nancy L. Buck 65 Pembroke Center Archivist at Brown University. So today we're talking a little bit about women's history. I'm really excited to talk about this. The project is Brown Women Speak. It's a collection of women's stories that have been gathered and collected over the past several years, and Mary's going to talk a little bit about the project today. It's a huge collection and continuing to be collected. Talk to us a little bit about this project.
Okay, so Brown Women Speak was started in 1982 by a group of interested Pembrokers. Those are women who graduated from Pembroke College, which was the women's college in Brown University until 1971. So interested alumni, after the rolling in of Pembroke College into Brown University, wanted to make sure that their history was captured and preserved for all time. And so they got together and started interviewing each other. This project grew and grew and grew, and it continues to grow today, and we add interviews every year. This year I think we added about 8 interviews from women who not only attended just Pembroke College, but also Brown University, younger alumni, recent graduates, etc.
I mean, it gives me goosebumps just hearing about the project. These women decided that this was so important that they actually sat down and interviewed each other. I was looking back at some of the data. This starts, you have interviews, 1907 was the earliest one, so we're talking gathering the history before the history is gone.
Right. So Marjorie Wood was the name of the first woman who was, well, let me say this, not the first to be interviewed, but she was the oldest graduate to be interviewed. So she graduated from Pembroke College in 1911, if you can believe it, and her memories date back to 1907.
Wow.
So we are I'm not really quite sure when that interview took place. I believe it was in the 80s, at which point she was a very old woman at the time, but she's recalling her memories back to the 1910s, basically, which is just unbelievable. Right, so she is our oldest contributor to the collection. And then our youngest is a woman who did a family interview, Sarah Foreman, and she graduated in the class of 2013.
Wow.
So, yep, right up to date.
So we're looking at, I mean, there's so many stories to be told. Talk to us a little bit about, so we're looking at the 1910s all the way up to 2013, so current times. Talk to us a little bit about what some of these stories include, the course of history that's told through women's eyes.
So it's really a story of American history. That's what I like to say. It's not just women's history, but this project is a way, it's a lens through which to study really all of U.S. history, mostly in the Eastern Seaboard, right? So for teachers, I always recommend this project for teachers and students if you're interested in studying World War I, World War II, Prohibition, suffrage, the women's rights movement, class struggles, race struggles, experiences on college campuses, life in dormitories for women in the 1930s. Really, you can plug into any topic that you might want to study.
It's absolutely fascinating, and you worked on, well, before we get to the digitization, we'll get to that in a minute. Let's dig into some of these issues, because you can go in and you can read these women's stories, or you can listen to these women's stories, and it really is all of these topics. You can look at anything from living in a dorm, what that was like. You can look at race issues. You can look at segregation, whether that's being a woman being segregated from the men on campus, or if it's a racial issue. You can look at issues dealing with Vietnam. You can look at World War I, World War II. You can there are so many things that tells the story of American history. What is it like being part of that project and looking, reading, listening to these stories?
Well, it's really just incredibly moving. So today, in preparation for coming here, I was reviewing some of the greatest hits, right?
Yeah.
We have some interviews that are just, I love them, right? So there was a woman whose last name was Tyrell, and she graduated in 1943. Justine Tyrell, I believe her first name was. She was at Brown University on Pearl Harbor Day, right? So she's sitting in the John Hay Library when a classmate comes in and tells her that Pearl Harbor has happened. And she said there was a wave of noise that went across this very quiet library, and suddenly it was just an explosion of noise and activity around campus at this pinnacle point for a global event that's taking place. This same woman then goes on, graduates, and in 1961 she becomes a journalist with the New York Amsterdam News, which is the oldest black newspaper, which is still in operation today. So she's working as a woman in Harlem. She's a white woman herself, but writing for this historically black newspaper. And she gets to cover the best, most important civil rights events that occur in the 1960s. So she's got interactions with Malcolm X. There's a photograph of her standing next to Martin Luther King's wife. She was everywhere. And then she sits down years later and recounts this incredible life. And for me, it's just goosebumps. It's wonderful.
It's the same. And I'm not even fully invested and involved in these archives, but just being able to recount that and listen back to it. You mentioned kind of going over some of the greatest hits. Do you have any other stories that kind of stand out or pop out?
Well, so we have we have an interview that we just did recently with a woman whose name is Mary Jane Mercurio. She graduated in the class of 1956. So she, again, was a student. She is of Japanese and then Austro-Hungarian descent, right? So she's got European and Japanese lineage, and then she comes to Pembroke College and recalls her experience of being a mixed race, multiracial student on campus in a time when that was particularly difficult, from a particularly difficult background, right? So, and she speaks about those struggles to be on campus at that time, her difficulties in making friends, and then her successes on campus, and the stories that she really loved about being at Pembroke College. So what I think is so wonderful about this interview that she did is it's not all rosy, right? Brown Women Speak isn't there to be an advertisement for Brown University. Mm-hmm. It's really a window or a way for people to study U.S. history, the good with the bad. So I really recommend that people do check it out for their school studies, whether they be American historians or students in the classroom.
And so I was kind of curious too, is what do you think that we can, whether it's young women, you're an 11-year-old girl that's just interested in what it's like to grow up in America, mm-hmm. or whether you're a 65-year-old man, what do you think we all can learn from these archives?
Well, that history matters, number one, that the humanities matter, and that we want to support the humanities programs in higher education and in secondary education, knowing our history matters today and everything that we do. So Brown Women Speak is just a tool that reinforces that important point. And also to learn about local history, if you want to study micro-histories. Yeah. Also, you can study them in aggregate. We've got students and scholars right now who are studying just the experience of women in World War II. So really there's something for everyone in Brown Women Speak.
What I think is really neat too is that you're able to get specific memories and their voices, and you're able to hear the women tell the stories in their own words, which if you go back and you're looking at historical context, it doesn't always put it into the point of view of these people. So you might miss something. If you're reading a history book, you might miss out on that. And so if you go back and you're looking at a personal account, there's just something real about that, because it is real.
There is. It's the voice, right? So we heard this from one of our researchers, and she was using Brown Women Speak to study prohibition. And she said that there is just something incredibly moving about the voice and the human voice and how different it was for her as opposed to reading the documents. So oral histories are considered to be primary resources, right? They capture a singular experience, a person's individual experience and their memories of the past. This is absolutely different than a textbook, which is a secondary source, right? So again, their memories, they can be faulty, okay? So we always say that you want to back up your study of primary resources with secondary resources, but to be moved by history, oral histories can really do that for you and bring history to life.
It's absolutely fascinating. So I thought it was so cool because you do a good job. Well, let's talk a little bit about digitizing the archive. You started that in 2012-ish and just recently finished, right? How important was that to be able to take the collection of these stories and be able to digitize them and then make them available to the public?
So this was a hard project, not gonna lie. Right, so the project started and the interviews were collected on audio cassettes, right? So first we had an analog to digital problem, basically. So we had technology issues, and then we had rights issues and privacy issues.
I'm just gonna have you scoot over a little bit.
And so we had all of these technological issues that we had to tackle before they could be opened. So it took a lot of work, a lot of manpower, right? Because everything that's digital, there's a human behind that work. And then over the course of many years, resource dedication, that's how we got it done. So we actually just finished our backlog a year ago. We're now up to date, but it took just a ton of dedication.
That's very impressive. I was reading some of the stories and then listening to some of the stories, and yeah, you can hear the tape recorder clicking. Mm-hmm. And you do have to remember that some people, they all are giving their oral histories at different points in their life. Mm-hmm. So I was listening to one woman's story, Beatrice Coleman. She was the class of 1925, mm-hmm. and she passed away on April 3rd, 2014 at the age of 109. Mm-hmm. Her story was fascinating. So she was an African-American woman at the time. And so just to look at her story involved, and she talked about a ton of different things. She talked about race relation in her interview. And I found it so interesting. She was like, I wanted to go to Howard, but my parents made me go to Brown. So just giving that perspective. Mm-hmm. And she graduated in 1925. So you can imagine, but it was fascinating to hear her perspective. Oh. So you don't have to imagine. You get to hear it firsthand. So it's beautiful. But also an interview with someone who's 100 years old.
Right. Definitely we have a lot of the women who were interviewed had long lives, right? Long. So again, the graduate from 1911, she lived to be 103. She was a librarian at Harvard.
Incredible.
Just really these miraculous lives, right? So these were smart women. They were smart. They are very smart women who care a lot about history, and they want to make sure that their legacy is remembered as well.
It's absolutely beautiful. If you get a chance to go check it out, we'll have a link to the Pembroke Center digital collection of Brown Women Speaks. So this is just one collection. You're the archivist there, and you're curating all kinds of stuff all the time. What are you currently working on now?
Okay, so yeah, we have a lot of different collections, and the one that's right in the gate right now are the papers of Anne Fausto Sterling. So she has a connection to Brown. She was a teacher of biology, and she studied human sexuality and intersexuality. And she donated her papers, her scholarly papers, to our collection. Oh, wow. So it's a wonderful treasure trove of correspondence and research and print material, rare 1970s print pamphlets and newsletters. She was a hardcore feminist in addition to a scholar, and I highly recommend for those interested in the meeting of science, gender, biology, check out the papers of Anne Fausto Sterling.
It would be fascinating too to see, just those early roots in the 70s, that scientific basis, and now we're at 2018, mm-hmm. to see how far we've come and where society stands now as well, right?
Anne Fausto Sterling, just to recall, she was a professor that was at Brown for many, many years up until almost the current time. So she was in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s.
So do we have all of her research that whole time?
We have a lot of it. Not all of it, but
a lot of it?
Yeah.
That's mm-hmm. fascinating. Mm-hmm. And is that digitized as well, or is that in no,
on
display?
Only Brown Women Speak is fully digitally available. Okay. Our other collections are truly archival in nature. We create a guide for every collection to the folder level. That means you're going to have a full map to every collection that's available for research, and that's going to tell you what's in the collection. But to really see it, you've got to come visit us at the John Hay Library, and that is open to the public.
That is. We've actually had visitors from the John Hay Library come in. Yep.
Oh, that's good.
Fun to there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yes, there is.
It's definitely worth the time to go take a visit. Mm-hmm. Well, Mary, thanks so much for joining us here. This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you for sharing your story with us. Part of the oral history, right?
Yep, that's right. Thanks very much.
So we're wrapping up here today on GoLocal Live in the 3 o'clock hour. Josh Fenton kicks things off in just a few moments for Business Monday, starting at 4 o'clock. Thanks so much for joining us today. Have a good one.